Back on Big Ten Today as we continue to dive into the Penn State-Iowa battle. It is the 31st all-time meeting, the 6th time when both have been ranked. Though they lost at home last year, the Nittany Lions have had the upper hand of late in this series, winning the previous 6 before that one, including 3 straight at Kinnick. As promised now, Audrey Snyder, the Penn State beat writer from The Athletic, joins us. Audrey, I want to start with this. I mean, this is a team that was 0-5 out of the gate last year. They are 5-0 this year. We've talked about it. This is the first time that's happened in college football since 1989 when Tennessee did it. So how do you account for this dramatic turnaround?
You know, it's pretty wild. I think this is one of those things where everybody last year wanted to point to a COVID year, and they kept saying, like, oh, this is the anomaly. Understandably, you had to be skeptical. I mean, covering these guys every day like I do, you think, all right, you know, I never imagined they'd be that bad at 0-5. But I think a big reason why has been the turnaround with this offense. You look at what Mike Yurcich has been able to do. He comes in here. It's, hey, can you remake Sean Clifford? Can you make Sean Clifford a good quarterback? And he's been able to do that. And to Clifford's credit, I mean, he's put in the work, but they're clicking. And I think equally surprising is how much better Brent Pry's defense has been from 0-5 last year to 5-0 this year.
Definitely want to talk about Brent Pry's defense and the approach there in a moment. But since you're referencing Sean Clifford, I'm curious, what has James Franklin, what has Mike Yurcich credited with the level of play we've seen from Sean Clifford? Because he was talented, he was gifted, but what we've seen in certain games this season, I mean, he looks like a Heisman contender at times.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, I think you could have said, hey, if Sean Clifford, best case scenario, if he gets rebuilt into this quarterback, I think it looks like the guy who's playing right now. Last year, and Sean was really open and honest about this too, he was trying to force too much. He was trying to make things happen. He starts pressing. I think it gets more difficult, you know, as the losses kept stacking up. But it was the turnovers. It was the fact that now he's okay with taking the check down, something that we're seeing him do more of. The other good thing about his game is, you know, we've been told over the years we don't give him enough credit for his mobility, for his athleticism. Well, you look at him now and he's taken off running, but he's keeping his eyes down the field, focused on making plays there and not just running with the ball. So it's been all around a lot better from Sean Clifford. And let's be honest, guys, I mean, it helps when you have Jahan Dotson to throw the ball too as well.
Yeah, no doubt. The flip side of that is, and we were talking about this in the last segment, Anthony and I were, I'm surprised they're not running it better, Audrey, based on what we saw when we were at camp. I think this is a loaded running back room. I know Noah Cain, it's unclear what's going on with him, but it feels like there's something going on with him, just to the extent that his carries have been minimized. I do feel like what happened last week against Indiana was somewhat aberrational or maybe misleading in terms of the yardage, just because there were some chunk plays in there, but kind of the base run just isn't there. Do you feel like that's an offensive line issue? Are the backs not as good as it felt like they were when we were at camp? Because it seems to me that to win this game, you're going to have to be able to have something in the run game. Otherwise, Iowa just sits on things defensively and makes it miserable for Clifford.
Yeah, and to me, it's the short down plays, too, the third and shorts, which we really saw against Indiana that were problematic for Penn State. And I do think it's a combination of things. I mean, sometimes we can pin it on the offensive line a little bit, but I do think, had you told me going into this year that the running backs would look like they did, I'd be surprised, because I think this is the deepest position group on paper on the team, and it just hasn't lived up to it. And I'm with you. Noah Cain did not look himself last week. I know that James Franklin acknowledged that in the lead up to the Villanova game that Noah was banged up. He was slowed a bit that week. Now you can kind of justify that and say, well, it's Villanova. You know, it's a good time to get the guy some rest. But just watching Noah Cain on the field last week, he looked uncomfortable to me. And that was surprising, because whatever's going on there, whatever he's trying to work through, train through, they got to have him. And I'll mention this as well. If you go back to Noah Cain's freshman year, his breakout game was in Kinnick Stadium against Iowa. So if ever there's a time to get back on track, it's going to have to be on Saturday.
And we will see how that matchup plays out, that run game versus an Iowa stout run defense. On the other side of the ball for the Nittany Lions, we were talking very briefly about Brent Pry previously, and it seems that his approach this year is more aggressive. It seems like there's a blitz package that's expanded beyond maybe what we've seen in the past. Has that approach been a part of what Brent Pry had planned coming into the year?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been huge. And I'll go back to a conversation I had with Brent in May when I was working on my Penn State State of the Program story. And he said that they have versatility and they want to tap into it. And I think that's one of the differences with this defense. I mean, you're looking at a secondary that all offseason it was supposed to be the most talented secondary that James Franklin has had, and they're living up to it. I mean, Penn State's +6 in the turnover margin, and they've got pieces that can move around, that can fly around. I mean, you look at a guy like Sam linebacker Curtis Jacobs. This is a rare skill set. I mean, this is a guy who was a safety, a wide receiver in high school, and they make him into, a Sam linebacker. And so you've got the flexibility and the versatility to make all these blitzes work. But yes, I mean, Penn State is blitzing at one of the most impressive, one of the highest clips in the country. And it's something that I had asked Brent probably last week, like, hey, do you expect to sustain this, right? Because, you often look at game plans and how teams try to line up to create a plan to beat a base defense. Well, when you're blitzing at as high of a clip as Penn State is, that's certainly challenging. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon because they've got the athletes to do it.
Audrey, before we let you go, you care to make a prediction here?
I did. I will go with it. I think we're going to be spoiled again by another crazy good Penn State-Iowa game. I'm going to go a little higher than 6-4, though. I'm actually picking Penn State 21, Iowa 20.
Oh,
all right. Yeah, 6-4. That will live in infamy, that game for sure. Audrey Snyder, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And keep up the great work on The Athletic. Thanks a lot.
You got it. Thank you.
We turn our attention to hoops tomorrow and Friday on the Big Ten Network. 2 days of men's and women's media day coverage. Every coach's news conference, plus we'll chat with star players tomorrow at 8 a.m. Eastern, Friday at 8:30 Eastern, only here on the Big Ten Network. There is no official preseason media poll in the Big Ten, but Brendan Quinn of The Athletic and Adam Jardy of the Columbus Dispatch have been filling that void with an unofficial poll. For the last 5 years, they surveyed 28 media members. They published it today. Michigan, the narrow choice to win the league over Purdue, the tie broken on first place votes. Illinois and Ohio State next. Kofi Coburn of Illinois, the preseason player of the year. Michigan's Caleb Houston, preseason freshman of the year. And with that, Brendan Quinn, our big interview today. So let's start at the very top. Brendan, Purdue brings virtually everyone back from a team that got better and better as last year went on. Michigan loses a ton, but has this incredible freshman class, has one really good high-impact transfer as well. So how do you separate those two, Purdue and Michigan?
Yeah, interesting. Exact same expectations and polar opposite situations. When you look at Purdue, I mean, you have to be excited with, you have, maybe the budding star in the league, Jaden Ivey back with Travion Williams, who's been, a staple in this league for a long time now. And when you look at Michigan, as I wrote today, talent wins. Michigan just on paper might very well have, the most pro talent in the league. So Hunter Dickinson is back. There's a similar question in the backcourt, though. As this time last year, we were asking, how does Mike Smith transfer from Columbia to Michigan and compete at the Big Ten level? Now we're asking it about Devontae Jones. So coming from Coastal Carolina, it's a huge step up to the Big Ten. He'll be handed the ball from day one. What does that look like? So we'll see. But those are, based on the poll, those two really separated themselves in terms of expectations among writers in the league. And then kind of Illinois is just right behind those two, I would say.
And yet, here's what I found interesting. You cover Michigan for The Athletic, and yet you had both Purdue and Illinois ahead of the Wolverines. What was the basis for your decision there?
To annoy readers, of course, no.
That's always the goal, right? Yeah.
when I look at Michigan, at the end of the day, it's still, there's 9 scholarship players on that roster that are freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah.
There's going to be a void to fill when you look at replacing Franz Wagner, replacing Isaiah Livers, replacing Mike Smith, replacing Shawnee Brown. Like that was a lot of minutes. It was a lot of experienced minutes. I think Michigan's going to be very good. I think it is a Final Four contender, but there just might be some more growing pains than those other schools along the way. When I it's really hard when you have Hunter Dickinson, Kofi Cockburn, and Travion Williams as these kind of staples at each place in the middle, and then you have to evaluate what's all around them. So I do think Cockburn is just a touch better than Dickinson. Dickinson probably just a touch better than Travion Williams. But those for those programs to kind of have those foundational pieces really says a lot, and it's probably why we're having this conversation of why they all are toss-ups. I think a week ago I might have had it in a different order and talked myself into this for now. So we'll see how I feel next week, though.
I'm not sure we'll be able to get back to you next week to see whether you've changed your opinion. So we're going to stick with you with Michigan at 3. But it's interesting you bring up the big guys, right? And I think this is what's been very interesting about the Big Ten these last few years is college basketball has really evolved into a guards game. I mean, to me, from where I sit anyway. And yet the Big Ten has been somewhat aberrational, where there have been these dominant big men. Luka Garza, of course, was arguably the best player in the country last year. And you talk about these elite teams now with really good big men. We didn't even mention Trayce Jackson-Davis at Indiana. And I want to get into the Hoosiers a little bit because I think that's a really interesting storyline as well. You have 3 new coaches in the Big Ten. Micah Shrewsbury taking over at Penn State. Ben Johnson at Minnesota. They are really rebuilding their roster. And then you have Mike Woodson at Indiana, and he was really active in the transfer portal, but maybe more importantly, he convinced Trayce Jackson-Davis to stick around for another year. And again, you cover Michigan. We've seen Juwan Howard and kind of how this worked. A coach with an NBA pedigree, who's an alum of the school, who kind of understands the glory years of what it was all about, who came back and started to restore that glory. That's the challenge ahead of Mike Woodson here. So what has to happen for this to work at Indiana in the same way that it seems to be working at Michigan?
Yeah, I would say one big difference between what Juwan Howard and Howard did at Michigan and what Mike Woodson's doing at Indiana is, Juwan Howard walked into a situation where he had Xavier Simpson, and it was a lead point guard who you knew was going to play 36 minutes a game and basically carry over everything that had been done, right? Obviously tweaks to the offense, so on and so forth. But, that I think all things considered, going from John Beilein to Juwan Howard, having someone like Xavier Simpson made that relatively smooth because he's a point guard, right? And everything ran through him. When you look at Indiana, I think the biggest question on this roster is the guards. It's been this way for a while, basically since they tried to replace Yogi Ferrell, looking for that kind of top third of the Big Ten caliber point guard. Where's it been? Is it going to be Xavier Johnson right now, the transfer from Pitt? I don't know. We'll see. But having a guy like Trayce Jackson-Davis is obviously huge to build around. But when your best player is a postman as compared to a point guard, that to me is a big difference. But when you look at the Juwan Howard, Mike Woodson parallels of going from pro to college, Juwan's might have been able to kind of accelerate a little bit quicker because of the hand he was dealt.
And they'll have to shoot it a lot better around Jackson-Davis. We'll see whether or not some of these additions allow them to do that. You noted 6 different players got Player of the Year votes. I said Kofi Cockburn ended up winning it, and one of the things that you pointed out was that is twice the number that have ever gotten Player of the Year votes in the previous years that you've done this. Again, it's not a huge statistical sample, but does that tell you something more broadly about the Big Ten, or do you think it's just a function of not having a dominant player, a Luka Garza type guy?
No, I mean, I think because when I look at all 6, I think all 6 of those guys are potential All-Americans, right? They're not just the best players in the league. I think they're all potentially among the best players in the country. There is a very healthy dispersion of kind of top talent in this league where, last year it was basically Luka, we talked about Ayo, and then it was everyone else. Before that, it was Cassius Winston. Before that, it was Carson Edwards and some Ethan Happ, and before that, it was Miles Bridges, and then everyone else. Now, we could sit here and talk for half an hour trying to argue, who is really the best player or the best college fit or the best possible pro among, Kofi Cockburn, Jaden Ivey, EJ Liddell, Hunter Dickinson, Trayce Jackson-Davis, Travion Williams, and then there's some guys who aren't even that far out of that conversation.
Brendan Quinn from The Athletic, really good stuff here. As you said, we could go on for quite some time. And in fact, we're going to do that tomorrow here on the Big Ten Network, and Friday for that matter. So looking forward to it. We will see you in Indy. Safe travels, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Jay.
We've been doing this every week with your top five, the Impact Five, Ant's Impact Five. So I know you like to count it down. I say Letterman style. Let's start with number 5. Where do you go?
Well, I think that obviously all the teams who are in the top 5 are having spectacular seasons up to this point, and the list overall who's included in the 5 are the same in a slightly different order because of where we've kind of gone in recent weeks. So let's start at number 5. And I think that, the state of Michigan has 2 of the top teams in the Big Ten as it sits right now. I, at number 5, put the Michigan Wolverines there for just a moment because they're still a team that I think is emerging. They've got a passing attack that's improving. Still some meat on the bone there for where I think their offense can go. But love what's happening with Mike McDonald and the defensive side of the football.
I'm with you. I think this is a huge week for them. I still don't really understand how good Nebraska is. I think we'll learn a lot more. I think we'll learn a lot about both of these teams coming up this weekend. I feel like I'll have a much more definitive opinion of Michigan next week, and you keep kind of pushing it down the road a little bit. And I think I said that a little bit going into the Wisconsin game, but beginning to think Wisconsin really isn't all that good. So I do think this is a better measuring stick. We'll see. We'll see. Right. Okay, so you got them at 5, and then based on that, it sounds like you have Michigan State at 4.
I do. And it was splitting hairs a little bit between the two teams, but Michigan State is just doing everything well. Not everything every single week, but every phase of their game has had a way of making plays in key moments this season, whether it's been the big play offense, whether it's been a Heisman caliber running back, whether it's been, the ability on defense to sack the quarterback, or certainly special teams and having big plays and touchdowns coming from that phase of the game. So they are well heeled in every spot. And if you're going to do that and keep it going in that manner, then your offense can have an off day on occasion. Your defense can have an off day on occasion, and another phase can pick you up.
Defense has had some off days.
Yeah.
And whether or not Rutgers is good enough offensively to take advantage of that, not really sure. I will tell you, I'd be shocked if Jaden Reed returns a punt this week. Right? Adam Korsak is so good. He's such a great punter that I just can't see him. I feel I just feel like
going
he'll
to these games thinking I can coach him up.
Kick it out of
Stay in your lane.
Kick it out of bounds.
If you were covering the punt, they would be yelling, "Stay in your lanes, Revsine," and just think they can coach you up.
If I was covering the punt, they'd be putting their
they'd have a long day on their
hands in front of their eyes and averting their gaze. Okay, so how do you organize the top 3 here?
I'm going Buckeyes at number 3 because Ohio State is emerging. They're ascending. What we saw the other day looked like the Ohio State team we kind of thought we would get. There's so much newness. There's so much youth in Columbus right now. So perhaps expectations outsized, but those are just the expectations you get when you're a Buckeye. But what we saw the other day against Rutgers, it surprised me. I really didn't think they would just come and mow down the Scarlet Knights in the way that they did. Maybe it says something about Rutgers. I tend to think it says quite a bit about Ohio State. Almost tempted to put them even higher, but I got to take a little bit of a wait-and-see approach, especially with that Buckeye defense. Give it to me for more than a week against a high level of competition.
Right. There are more question marks, it still feels, about them than there are about the teams that you have at the top 2, Iowa and Penn State. In what order do you have those 2?
So I shifted my top 2. I previously had Penn State at number 1 for a couple of weeks in a row. I've moved them to number 2.
Why?
Because I see the Hawkeyes ascending at a level that maybe even goes beyond, and that in my opinion goes beyond what I've seen from Penn State. Sean Clifford looked a little more uncomfortable in that game against Indiana last week than he had looked in a few weeks. Still made some plays through the air and with his legs, so that's great. But the Hoosier defense did throw a few wrinkles at him. He threw the early interception, and that run game still hasn't been able to find its teeth. And like you were talking about in short yardage scenarios, so I think that goes into the discussion we were having earlier about how Mike Yurcich, how Sean Clifford finds a way to find yards and find points against an Iowa defense that's playing as well as anyone in college football.
I'm with you. I do think Indiana has a good defense.
Yeah.
However, it's nothing compared to what Penn State's going to face this week.
Right. I mean, we've seen my top team, the Iowa Hawkeyes, week in and week out, make everyone uncomfortable. That sort of vice grip that they put around opponents on defense, on special teams, on offense. Everything they're doing just seems to be this cascade of this domineering Kirk Ferentz approach that opponents just seem to wear down throughout a game. And it's not just all the physical aspect of it. Even the schematic end just seems to sort of wear opponents out where they don't see opportunities for plays to be made. They don't turn it over. They don't give up shot plays. They don't allow you any run lanes. And at a certain point, when you're an opponent facing that, and especially facing that on the road like Penn State's going to be this week, when they go to Kinnick Stadium, we see folks wilt. We'll see whether or not Penn State can stand up against that this Saturday. But you're adding in some of that explosion that they've gotten on the passing attack a little bit here the last couple of weeks. And now we see an Iowa offense that's coming more closer to what that championship level is that we see from the D.
That was encouraging last week offensively. Now, we've talked about already, field position was incredible. I mean, average starting position was near midfield. But still, Maryland was pretty good defensively coming into that game. And Iowa really shredded them. So back on Big Ten Today and back to the biggest football showdown of the week. Here's what Scott Dochterman of The Athletic had to say about Penn State and Iowa. Quote, "Nobody calls Iowa-Penn State a rivalry. It doesn't have a nifty name or trophy. It doesn't need one. That the series reaches its climax Saturday with the number 3 Hawkeyes and number 4 Nittany Lions facing off at Kinnick Stadium makes it special, but it's only the latest episode in what might be the Big Ten's best and most organic non-rivalry." As promised, Scott Dochterman joining us now, and let's start there. Scott, build the case for this rivalry.
There have been so many incredible games between these two teams over the years. I mean, you start with 6-4 back in 2004, one of the legendary, I would say, scores in Big Ten history, at least over the last generation. But you look at 2008 when Penn State was 9-0 and ranked 3rd in the country, went to Kinnick and got beat on the last play of the game. The next year, Adrian Claiborne's blocked punt in Happy Valley with that kind of deflated number 5 Penn State. And then you speed ahead to 2017, which I think the most incredible performance I've ever seen live was Saquon Barkley's effort at Kinnick Stadium. And Josie Jewell had 16, 17 tackles, and it came down to the very last play of the game when Trace McSorley hit Juwan Johnson. And there have just been so many great moments between these two teams. And here they are, 800 miles apart. They used to be the outposts of the Big Ten. There's really not much in common with these schools. There's not a trophy. They're not, talking smack back and forth. But every time they play, boy, something good happens. And I think we're in for another one on Saturday.
And who can forget Kirk Ferris's first Big Ten road win, a double overtime affair when the woeful Hawkeyes went on the road in 2000.
Might you have been involved in that game?
I might have been on the field for that particular contest, David. But this year's Hawks, who started off ranked, have ascended almost on a weekly basis. The offense itself earlier in the season felt like more of a question than they are at this point. And part of the reason is a couple of young receivers. I'm curious for your thoughts on what you've seen from Keegan Johnson and Arlen Bruce.
Yeah, I think both receivers have ascended into being really important players in that rotation, and both came aboard early. They both enrolled in January, and Keegan Johnson, his father played at Nebraska during their championship era, just a really polished receiver for as young as he is. And then Arlen Bruce is kind of a different type of playmaker. Yeah, he can move around and do all kinds of different things. He used to be a running back by nature. His father played in the NFL, so both of them, as they've ascended and become more and more instrumental in that offense, it's allowed Spencer Petras to do more things with the ball in his hands. And we've seen that with Spencer Petras, where in 2 consecutive weeks, he's had his 2 best games. And I think there's a correlation there with the 2 freshman receivers ascending.
Scott, I want to talk about the other side of the ball because it's what everyone is talking about with Iowa. And look, they are good defensively year in and year out. They've had 6 straight years, top 20 in the nation in scoring defense. We talk a lot on our network about the fact that Phil Parker does not get, I don't think, the praise that he deserves nationally because he's he's not one of these hot names, right? He's not looking to be the next head coach somewhere. He's perfectly happy in the role that he's at in Iowa City. But man, he is phenomenal. So I don't want to pretend this is some new formula. That being said, it's pretty obvious what the formula has been this year. They are limited offensively, or at least they appear to be somewhat limited offensively. And I agree with your premise that they're getting better. But field position has been such a key part of what they've done this year, and that has been premised on the turnovers. So can this formula work to the extent they need it to against a team that doesn't make a whole lot of mistakes? And Penn State appears to be a team that doesn't make a whole lot of mistakes, although Maryland appeared to be the same thing before last week.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough formula if you can't turn the football over. But I think what they've been able to do is marry elite level defense, because even if they aren't intercepting passes, which they're doing at a rate that nobody in the country can compare with, but they're limiting big plays. They're forcing teams to go the length of the field against an elite level defense. I mean, the secondary, all 5 of their starters have started stretching into at least 2019. So they're veterans. They understand the scheme. They understand where to play and how to play. And then you look at the linebacking core. Jack Campbell is, in my opinion, maybe the best linebacker Iowa's ever had, at least under Kirk Ferentz. And that's saying a lot because he's had some really good ones, but he just does things in every facet that nobody else can compare with. And I think if Iowa can play that type of defense, they're going to force teams to go the length of the field, and they're going to get frustrated. They're going to struggle, and eventually they're going to make a mistake. Now, as long as the offense is playing risk averse, they can play field position, and we've seen that formula work for Iowa year after year. And of course, if the other team turns it over the way Maryland did, the way Iowa State did, or Indiana did, then they can take advantage of it. And that's really what's enabled them to not only win 11 straight games, but 10 of which by at least double figures.
Scott, we did this with Audrey. I feel like we need to do it with you as well. We need a prediction.
This is going to be a great game, a tough game. I'm going to go with the Hawkeyes by 3. I just think that if you get into the fourth quarter at Kinnick Stadium, it's a close game. There's a lot of back and forth. I like Iowa's chances just based on what I've seen, because I think at some point they're not going to make a mistake. And Penn State, while has been very good this year, they've shown in the past that they do have that kind of gene in them at times. So I think this is probably Iowa's opportunity to win by a field goal and have another one of those charge of the field moments.
Scott, thanks, and thanks for the brilliant positioning of that third book down over your left shoulder. I'm glad it's in your collection.
One of my great reads. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for having me on.
Scott Dochterman from The Athletic. Really appreciate it.